My name is Amira. I am 17 years old. And the first time I realized that silence was not peace, but survival, I was standing barefoot on the icy kitchen tiles of a house I had never been allowed to call mine. It was late evening, and the house was thick with the smell of turmeric and overcooked meat. The sound of oil popping from the stovetop mingled with the heavy beat of Arabic music on the radio, a station my mother left on for hours not because she enjoyed it, but because it reminded her of a version of herself that didn't exist anymore. My father sat in his usual place, worn cushion, prayer beads slipping between his fingers like time he thought he could control, while the voices of my cousins echoed through the house like ghosts of who I was never allowed to become. I lived in a house where tradition was not a culture, it was a weapon. Where obedience was confused with love, and love was measured by how little of yourself you were willing to keep. I lived in a world where my worth was always handed back to me broken, reassembled to fit inside their expectations, quiet, submissive, invisible. My father once told me, in a tone so casual I might have mistaken it for affection, that good girls obey and smart girls listen. But clever girls, he said, narrowing his eyes at me like I was already a problem that needed solving, clever girls get ruined. Don't be clever, Amira. Don't get ideas. The irony? My whole life was an idea waiting to become something real. I wanted to be a doctor. That's it. No twist. No forbidden romance. No lofty rebellion. Just a girl with a fire in her chest and the audacity to dream about blood and anatomy and sterile gloves and the power of saving lives. It started when I was 12. A neighbor collapsed right outside her door. People screamed, shouted prayers, called for help but did nothing else. The paramedics came, 2 of them, calm as wind before a storm. They didn't panic. They didn't flinch. They took control. I watched from behind the curtains and thought, that. I want to be that. And so it began. I started reading secretly, library books smuggled into my backpack like contraband. I'd hide them in the pocket of my abaya, pressed flat so the cover wouldn't show. Gray's Anatomy, Pathophysiology, First Aid for the USMLE Step 1, titles I couldn't even pronounce at first, but devoured anyway. I read under the covers with a flashlight like some girls hide love notes. My love affair was with knowledge, with precision, with purpose. I wanted to know how things worked, not just the body, but power, control, self-ownership. I learned slowly, in silence, surrounded by voices that said girls like me should want simpler things. But I wasn't simple. And I stopped pretending to be. In public, I still played the part. I brought tea when asked. I kept my eyes down when relatives came over. I said yes, mama, and no, baba, and bit my tongue until it bled. But inside? Inside I was building an empire. Inside I was studying cardiac rhythms and liver enzymes and the function of the hypothalamus. I was building a future in fragments, hiding it in the creases of my day, like war refugees burying jewelry beneath dirt they'll never return to. My room was cold. Physically and spiritually. The walls were bare because my mother believed posters were a distraction and idolatry. My desk was a slab of wood with no drawers, no lamp. My books lived beneath my bed, wrapped in an old bedsheet, hidden from the cleaning lady who had once ratted me out for reading boy books. But that didn't stop me. I kept reading. Kept writing. Kept drawing diagrams on napkins, in the margins of old-school notebooks, on the back of receipts I'd found in my father's pockets. I memorized entire chapters. I whispered facts to myself when doing the dishes, timing my memorization to the rhythm of soap and rinse. And yet, for all that effort, all that invisible persistence, I remained a disappointment. My father laughed the first time I told him I wanted to study medicine. Not a chuckle, a laugh. A sharp, gut-level noise that broke something in my chest. He said I wasn't pretty enough to be a doctor. That people only took you seriously if you were attractive or obedient, and I was neither. That I had a smart mouth and suspicious eyes and a defiant chin. A girl like you, he said. Doctors are for good girls. I didn't respond. Not then. I learned early that responses were dangerous. My mother said silence was dignity. But I knew she meant submission. I also knew it was killing me. The turning point came at my cousin's engagement party. It was a humid evening. The house packed with people I barely knew, all of them stuffed into 2 small rooms and oversized opinions. Cousins in sequin dresses danced barefoot while my aunt tried to make everyone sit down for dinner. Someone brought up a pain in their lower stomach, maybe it was gas, maybe food poisoning, they joked. He said he'd felt like vomiting all day. I asked one question. Does it hurt more when you press on it and let go? Heads turned. Why? My cousin asked. Could be appendicitis, I said, barely louder than a whisper. Rebound tenderness. You should get checked. The room went still. And then the slap. My father didn't yell first. He stood, stepped forward, and before I could even flinch, his hand met my cheek with such force that my head snapped sideways and the laughter died in everyone's throat. Get out, he said. Not screamed, commanded. Like a general on a battlefield. A girl like you can never be a doctor. My skin burned. My ears rang. But my spine straightened. I walked upstairs without a word, holding my face with one hand, my dignity with the other. I sat on my bed for hours that night. Didn't cry. Didn't speak. I watched the shadow of the curtain swing with the wind and counted every breath I could still take without sobbing. And then I began my plan. I started tutoring the younger girls in my neighborhood. Quietly, at first, mostly math and science. I charged a few dinars at a time, kept it all in a jar beneath my laundry basket. I downloaded the applications for university and read every single requirement. I practiced mock interviews in the mirror, my bruised cheek covered with concealer I'd stolen from my older sister's drawer. I made a list of everything I needed to escape. ID copy. Grades. Passwords. USB drive. Shoes with thick soles. And then one night, I left. Not in anger. Not in fear. In silence. I packed my bag with 3 outfits, my medical notes, my savings, less than $200, and a book I had read so many times the pages were soft as fabric. I left a note for my sister. Just one line. Don't let them steal your voice. And I walked out of the house at 2:14 a.m. The night was thick with heat, but my body felt cold. Every step away from that house was a goodbye I had never been given permission to say. I walked to the bus station. I bought a ticket to the next city where I knew someone, an old teacher who once said I was the smartest student she'd ever had. She didn't ask questions when I showed up on her doorstep. She let me in. Gave me tea. And for the first time in years, someone looked at me like I wasn't broken. Just unfinished. When I first moved into the apartment on Bleecker Street, I told myself the mold crawling up the bathroom tiles was temporary. The room itself smelled like a mix of burnt plastic, damp carpet, and despair that had been sealed in for too many winters. It was one of those shared spaces students or drifters end up in, not because they want to, but because every safer option requires 2 months of rent, a blood sample, and a cosigner who believes in you. I had none of those things. There were 4 of us in total. I slept in what used to be a linen closet, though calling it a room was generous. The walls were cracked, the ceiling slanted like a drunk architect's idea of whimsy, and the only window was a rectangle of cheap plexiglass that let in the cold but none of the light. I didn't care. I had a door that locked, a stack of textbooks I bought secondhand, and a schedule pinned to the inside of my pillowcase. By day, I was a student, community college biology classes, with lectures that moved too fast and textbooks that cost more than the heating bill. By night, I scrubbed down booths and filled coffee cups at Berta's Diner, a 24-hour place where time forgot to move forward and the regulars came in like ghosts clocking their hauntings. It was exhausting. And not in the poetic, this struggle is beautiful kind of way people romanticize when they're no longer in it. This was bone-deep, cold-blooded, chronic exhaustion, the kind that lives in your joints and makes your teeth ache when you blink too hard. I went days without sitting down properly. I lost track of how many meals I skipped just to buy another organic chemistry workbook or print out an extra practice test for an exam I hadn't even had the energy to study for. Some mornings, I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the girl staring back. My skin was dull from lack of sleep, my eyes permanently rimmed with the kind of dark circles no concealer could fix. I had one coat, too thin for the winters, donated by a woman named Lydia, an older waitress at Berta's who worked the 2 a.m. shift because she couldn't sleep alone anymore. Her husband had died 2 winters before, and the silence in her apartment scared her more than the cold. She was one of the first people to see me. Not just serve me advice with a side of pity, but really see me. "You carry pain like it's armor," she once said as she poured me day-old coffee before the sun came up. "That's useful for a while, honey. But eventually it gets heavy. You gotta learn when to set it down." I didn't answer. I just nodded like I understood, though I didn't. Not yet. Still, I kept moving. I learned to do everything sleep-deprived, memorize cell structures, label diagrams, scrub grease traps, smile at customers who didn't tip, ignore the landlords who didn't fix the pipes, and pretend that I wasn't constantly doing math in my head about how much rice I had left in the pantry. Every day I asked myself one question: is this still worth it? Every day, the answer came back the same. Yes. Because no matter how impossible it felt, I was building something, even if no one else could see it. Every test passed was a brick. Every dollar saved was a nail. Every insult endured, every phone call ignored, every meal skipped was another silent vow that I was not going back. I would never go back. I didn't miss them. My family. That's what I told myself. But on some nights, when the pipe screamed and my fingers went numb from typing in the cold, I would pick up my prepaid phone and scroll through the contact list I had memorized from another life. I never called, not really, not until one night in January, after a shift where a man spilled soup on me and called me a slur because I didn't smile fast enough. I was so tired I couldn't cry. So tired the loneliness felt like background static. I just needed to hear someone say my name and mean it. I called the house number. I knew they hadn't changed it because I checked once a month from a payphone outside the diner. It rang 3 times. Then someone answered. Her voice was sharp. Businesslike. "This is Khalil Residence. If this is about the overdue balance, we've already." "It's me," I whispered, not even realizing I had spoken. "It's Amira." There was a pause. Then the click. No questions. No hello. No breath. Just the sound of a door being slammed shut from 800 miles away. And that was when I knew. There would be no apology. No invitation. No redemptive arc where the prodigal daughter was welcomed home, head bowed and dream buried, into the arms of people who claimed to have loved her. I was dead to them. And if I was dead to them, I had nothing left to lose. That night, I opened my biology textbook again. My hands shook from cold and caffeine and a kind of grief that had no name. But I studied anyway. I underlined every word. I diagrammed every artery. I reviewed every flashcard until the sunrise bled through the cracked plexiglass window and turned the mold on the wall a violent shade of gold. And in that silence, I kept moving. I built routines like scaffolding to keep myself from collapsing. Wake at 5. Classes from 7 to 2. Work from 4 p.m. to 1 a.m. Study from 1:30 to 3:30. Repeat. I slept in 2-hour chunks on buses, in the break room, under library desks. I bathed with a bucket when the heater broke. I walked everywhere because my legs were cheaper than a train ticket. I didn't get sick because I couldn't afford to be. And even if I had, I didn't have anyone to call. But something shifted during my 3rd semester. It started with Professor Ellis. He taught human anatomy at the college, gruff, old, the kind of man whose boredom showed in his posture but whose brilliance lit up the room whenever someone asked a real question. I asked a lot of questions. The other students rolled their eyes. One even told me to stop trying so hard, it made the rest of them look bad. But I didn't care. One day, after class, Ellis asked me to stay behind. "You're not from around here," he said, stating it like a fact, not a question. "No, sir," I replied. He looked at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "You're studying harder than anyone else in the department. And working nights at Berta's, if I'm not mistaken." I froze. "I need the money." "That's obvious," he said. "But that's not what I meant." I waited. He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were application forms, for medical school scholarships, specifically for immigrant women in STEM. "You don't belong here," he said. "You're meant for more than cafeteria chicken and underfunded labs." "You already know that, though." I stood there too stunned to speak. He turned back to his papers like it was no big deal. "There's a deadline. Don't miss it." I didn't. I applied. And 4 months later, while sitting in the back corner of the campus library with frost creeping up the windows and my 4th packet of instant noodles in my bag, I got the email. "Congratulations. Full tuition. Housing stipend. Lab access. A seat at the table." I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then I cried. Not pretty, movie scene tears. Not soft weeping into my scarf. I sobbed. Quietly. Violently. Into my hands. Because I had done it. I had clawed my way out of the hole they buried me in and built a ladder with nothing but grit and books and silence. No one called to congratulate me. No one sent flowers. No one said they were proud. But I didn't need them. Because when I stood up that day and looked in the mirror by the library's broken water fountain, I didn't see a girl pretending to be strong. I saw a woman who had already survived the fire, and was ready to walk into the next one. If there's anything they never tell you about medical school, it's that your body will begin to betray you long before your mind does. They warn you about the textbooks, how they weigh more than your first regrets, and they warn you about the exams, the endless acronyms, the rotations, the pressure, the panic. But no one tells you that by your 3rd semester, you will forget what your own handwriting looks like, what daylight feels like on your skin, and how to form a sentence that doesn't end with a clinical differential. I was 24 when I started the program, older than most of my cohort, poorer than all of them, and hungrier in ways none of them would understand until years later. I didn't own a car. I didn't own a wardrobe of crisp slacks and tidy cardigans like the other students. I arrived with one suitcase, a thrifted white coat, and the full weight of my own survival on my back. My student housing was shared with 2 other residents who came from generational wealth and generational expectation. Their fathers were surgeons. Their uncles were professors. Their mothers had written check after check to guarantee a head start I could barely afford to look at, let alone claim. But I didn't come to make friends or blend in. I came to learn how to save lives. I came to earn what I had nearly died building. I came with scars on my knuckles and burns in my bloodstream. And if anyone mistook my silence for meekness, they would learn very quickly that I was not here to be pitied or dismissed. I was here to conquer. The first year was all theory, dense lectures in impossibly cold lecture halls where the air smelled like anxiety, burnt coffee, and competition. I memorized charts like prayers, folded flashcards into my pillowcase, and listened to recorded lectures in my sleep like lullabies whispered from gods with stethoscopes. The nights were long. My back ached from the chairs in the library. My fingers were permanently ink-stained from scribbled notes, and my laptop keyboard was worn smooth from repeated sessions of typing past the point of comprehension. But it wasn't until we stepped into the anatomy lab that I understood what it meant to feel reverent. The cadaver lay before me, silent, skin peeled back like secrets, organs preserved in a soft, waxy stillness that made my voice catch every time I whispered an apology before slicing. There was something holy about that room. The chill in the air. The sound of metal against flesh. The low murmur of students dissecting both bodies and themselves. And for me, the moment I picked up the scalpel for the first time felt more like a vow than an action. I will not waste this. The exhaustion was constant. I developed a tremor in my left hand that wouldn't go away unless I wrapped it in a warm towel every night. I forgot what weekends were, what television sounded like, what holidays meant. My meals became whatever I could heat in under 5 minutes, eaten standing up, textbooks open beside my bowl. But I never complained. Not even when I passed out during my surgical rotation and woke up with an 4 drip in my arm and a reprimand on my student file. Not even when I was called into a disciplinary review board, where a junior administrator, one who had never set foot in an OR, told me my incident reflected a dangerous lack of resilience. I remember staring at her polished nails, the perfect lipstick that had clearly never known a 12-hour shift in a trauma bay, and forcing myself to stay quiet when every muscle in my body was screaming that I had given everything. Every single thing. And still, it wasn't enough for them. I thought I might get expelled. I could already see the shame on their faces, those faceless parents who had never once called, never once asked if I was still alive. But someone spoke up for me. Dr. Amira. She was one of the senior attendings in the internal medicine department, known for being impossibly sharp and impossibly hard to impress. Most students feared her. I admired her before I ever heard her speak. She walked through the hospital like a queen who'd built her kingdom with blood and brilliance. She sat beside me in the hallway after the hearing and didn't speak for a long time. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then finally, she said, "You remind me of myself. Too proud to ask for help. Too stubborn to quit. Too exhausted to keep pretending it's easy." I didn't answer. My throat was too tight. "You don't fix people with knowledge," she added, her voice soft, but unflinching. "You fix them by listening. Start with yourself." She became my mentor from that day on. Not formally. Not with titles or paperwork or weekly meetings. Just presence. Just trust. She gave me permission to make mistakes without making me feel like a mistake. And more than anything, she taught me how to listen, not just to lungs and heartbeats and murmurs, but to the unspoken grief in a patient's eyes, to the tremble in a hand that said more than their words ever could. That's how I began to transform. I stopped thinking of pain as something to diagnose, and started recognizing it as a language. Every symptom became a sentence. Every chart, a confession. And every time someone let me close enough to hold their hand during a procedure, I whispered silent promises to honor their fear like it was sacred. I started volunteering at free clinics on weekends, places the other students avoided because they weren't prestigious enough to pad their resumes. But I didn't go for credit. I went because I remembered what it felt like to be invisible. I saw it in the eyes of undocumented women who flinched every time someone in scrubs walked too fast. I saw it in the hands of men who couldn't afford insulin and were slowly going blind because of it. I saw it in the children who had never heard their names spoken gently in a doctor's voice. One day, a woman rushed into the clinic carrying a little boy who couldn't breathe. He was 6. Thin as paper. Wheezing so hard his entire chest caved in with every breath. The nurse on duty froze. The attending was late. And in that moment, without thinking, I stepped forward. I took his history in 30 seconds. I scanned his skin for signs of anaphylaxis. I noticed the red patches blooming across his chest and arms, the slight swelling in his lips, the faint chemical scent on his shirt. He had a latex allergy. His school had switched glove brands. I called it. I called it before the attending arrived. I administered the epinephrine. I monitored his oxygen. I kept his mother calm. And when the crisis passed, when he was breathing on his own and his fingers turned pink again, he took a crayon from his mother's purse and wrote my name on a scrap of paper. Just that. No doctor. No title. No formal thank you. Just my name. It was the first time someone wrote it without spite. Without shame. Without erasing it from the story. That night, I went home and pinned the drawing to my wall. Right above my bed. And for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of escape. Of course, life didn't pause to celebrate. A month later, someone from my old neighborhood emailed me a link to a local news article. My sister, Layla, had been profiled. Engineering prodigy. Award-winning projects. Featured on a panel of rising Muslim women in STEM. My parents were quoted. "She's our pride," my father said. "Our Layla always followed the right path," my mother added. Smart, respectful, successful. I wasn't mentioned. Not even as an estranged daughter. Not even as a footnote. They had erased me so thoroughly that my absence had become a virtue. But I didn't cry. Because I knew what they would never understand. Layla may have built bridges, but I had rebuilt myself. And there is no structure more sacred than a life reclaimed. The emergency room smelled like copper and sweat, like fear trapped under fluorescent lights, pumped full of adrenaline and code blues. It was the kind of holiday weekend that brought out the worst in everyone: firework burns, grill fires, heart attacks from too much salt, drunk driving accidents that split families open like faulty seatbelts. I had just finished a triple shift when the call came in: a priority trauma case en route, multiple systems involved, young female in her late 20s, ejected from the vehicle, status critical, suspected brain injury, unresponsive at the scene. The moment the radio crackled, the room transformed into something primal. Nurses bolted for crash carts. Residents scrambled to prep the trauma bay. A code orange alert screamed through the hallway like a warning too late to heed. I was already pulling my gloves back on when the gurney burst through the automatic doors and brought hell with it. Blood was everywhere, splattered across the paramedic's sleeves, soaking into the patient's clothes, pooling near the stretcher wheels. One eye was swollen shut. Her lip was split. Her right femur jutted sideways at an impossible angle. But it was the necklace that made the air leave my body like a vacuum had been opened in my chest. A thin gold chain. A small steel pendant. A shape I had seen before, years ago, pressed into a birthday card I was never meant to see. The name on her chart hadn't registered when it came through my tablet. Layla Khalil. I had seen 1,000 patients since I last said that name aloud. I had survived medical school, residency, 2 suicide attempts from patients I couldn't save, and the slow dying of my last relationship because I worked too many nights to be worth waiting for. But I had never once prepared for this. The woman on the table, crushed, unconscious, bleeding out faster than the team could stabilize, was the one my parents called perfect. The one they claimed as their legacy. The one who filled up articles, interviews, and Facebook pages while I was erased from photo albums like I had died and never deserved a headstone. And now she was mine to save or let go. "Dr. Khalil," my trauma nurse called out, voice clipped. "BP's dropping. GCS at 6. She's circling the drain." I didn't hesitate. Because no matter how many years had passed, no matter how many words had been weaponized against me, no matter how many birthdays went unacknowledged, I had not spent the last decade becoming a doctor just to let someone die because of old wounds. "Push 1 unit O-neg," I ordered, stepping into the trauma bay. "Prep for an emergent thoracotomy. Intubation, now. And page neurosurgery on standby. Let's move." The nurses followed without question. There was no room for past tense in the ER. Here, I wasn't a daughter disowned or a sister forgotten. I was a surgeon. I was the final line between breath and stillness. I was the only one who could keep her alive long enough to matter. I inserted the chest tube myself. I kept my hand steady while the room spun in fragments of memory I didn't ask for. I kept her heart beating. But I didn't call our parents. Not then. Not until the attending neurologist said she had a window of less than 30 minutes before intracranial pressure would make the damage permanent. She needed to go into surgery now, or she might not come back at all. They arrived 15 minutes later. The sound of their voices hit the walls of the hospital like a storm, a blend of panic and grief and too late apologies that no one had asked for. I was in the scrub room, tying the back of my surgical gown when the charge nurse came to get me. "Dr. Khalil," she said, her voice tight. "There's a man and woman in the waiting area." They're insisting the nurse told them you're the one operating. They said they're the patient's family. I walked slowly. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure if anything I said would land in the hearts of people who had spent a decade pretending I never existed. My father looked older than I remembered, his beard streaked with gray, his once firm voice trembling like glass too close to a ledge. My mother was clinging to him, her makeup smeared, her scarf slipping, her hands bloodied from where she had clearly fallen while rushing in. "Please," he said before I could open my mouth. The nurse said, "The only doctor on call who can save her is." His voice broke. He didn't finish the sentence. My mother turned toward me. Her knees buckled. She dropped. No pride. No anger. Just raw, pleading desperation in a woman who once told me she'd rather have no daughter than a disobedient one. "Please," she whispered, voice hoarse from crying. We were wrong. It should have felt like victory. It didn't. It felt like standing at the edge of a battlefield and realizing that no matter how many enemies you slay, the smoke will never let you breathe again. I said nothing. I turned, walked back toward the oar, and scrubbed in. "Let's begin," I said, my voice steel. Inside, the surgical lights buzzed. The room smelled of antiseptic and burnt tissue. The silence was total. I opened her chest cavity. I repaired her collapsed lung. I drained the blood pressing against her brain. I worked for 4 hours. My hands, once trembling from cold, from hunger, from exile, did not shake once. I didn't speak as the nurses handed me clamps. I didn't falter when the monitor dipped to critical. I didn't cry when I sutured the final incision and called it, "patient stable, vitals holding, post-op transfer to ICU ordered." I only let myself breathe when I stepped outside the room and let the weight of it all collapse into my spine. I had done it. I had saved the girl they chose over me. I had used the very hands they once said were unworthy to keep their pride and joy alive. I didn't wait for them afterward. I returned to the staff lounge, sat on the floor, and stared at the same fingers that used to tremble under fluorescent lights while I folded lab reports in half because I couldn't afford to print them twice. My phone buzzed. A text from the nurse. "Family wants to speak with you. Father is asking for your forgiveness. Should I tell them you'll be out?" I typed back one word. No. Because I didn't need to be thanked. I didn't need redemption. I didn't need a reconciliation wrapped in fresh grief and the stink of guilt. I needed silence. Because I had done what they never could. I had given what they refused to. And I had done it with grace, not for them, but for me. The envelope sat in my drawer for nearly 3 months, untouched, unopened, and folded with surgical precision, like something too sacred to destroy and too painful to revisit. I had sealed it on a rainy Sunday afternoon, my hand steady for the first time in weeks, each word poured from a heart that had been carved open by decades of silence, not for reconciliation, but for release. By the time I wrote it, Layla had already left rehab and was living in a quiet assisted apartment 2 blocks away from the main hospital, where I still pulled 40-hour weeks that often bled into 60. She had improved more than we initially believed possible, but the damage was permanent in all the ways that matter. The left side of her body moved with awkward, stilted hesitations, her words slurred unpredictably, and her brilliant, mathematician's mind struggled to balance even her own checkbook. Our conversations were polite and shallow, the kind of exchanges you'd expect from distant coworkers rather than siblings, both of us pretending that we weren't staring at a wall of memories too fractured to fix. She thanked me once, tearfully and earnestly, but I nodded and changed the subject before that gratitude became something I might be tempted to carry. I wasn't looking to be healed by her thank yous, and I didn't need a confession of guilt that would rot in the air between us. I didn't come to save her so she could save me. I did it because I was a doctor. Because the oath I took didn't include footnotes about family history, betrayal, or abandonment. Because if I started choosing who deserved to be saved, I would become just as cruel as the people who decided I didn't. Still, my parents didn't stop trying. They called 3 times after the surgery. The first time, it was my father, his voice raw, unfamiliar, and stripped of the thunderous certainty I remembered from childhood. He said my name like it was a prayer and a wound at once, stumbling through apologies that never landed. The second time, it was my mother, offering olive branches in the form of family recipes and holiday invitations, her voice too sweet to be trusted, too rehearsed to be real. The third time, it was both of them, together, begging me to come home and eat at their table like nothing had happened. "You're our daughter too," they said. The irony of that statement hit me so hard I laughed out loud, bitter and breathless, as if they'd just remembered I existed because the golden one had dimmed and they needed a new star to orbit around. So I wrote the letter. I wrote it not to start a dialogue or mend something that had never truly lived, I wrote it to finalize the record. To give my pain one last breath and then bury it with the dignity they had always denied me. I didn't mail it. I didn't email it. I kept it sealed, waiting for the day I would walk back into that house, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a witness to my own survival. That day came during the first week of spring, when the cherry blossoms outside the hospital began to bloom and everything smelled of something deceptively hopeful. I had a rare weekend off, and I decided it was time, not because they deserved closure, but because I did. I needed to look them in the eyes one last time, not to ask for anything, but to give them the truth they had tried so hard to suppress. I drove there in silence. No music, no calls, just the hum of the engine and the low, steady beat of my own pulse reminding me that this was not a return, it was an exit. The house hadn't changed, not in any of the ways that mattered. The same cracked steps led to the door, the same faint scent of incense clung to the curtains, and the same framed photo of Layla in her college robes hung over the mantel, untouched and glaringly alone. They greeted me like someone coming back from war, like a soldier who had served their sentence and was finally returning to the arms of grateful kin. But I didn't take off my coat, and I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of the living room like a patient examining the very illness they had once tried to escape. "We're so glad you came," my mother said, her voice trembling with hope, or maybe just the fear that I would leave before they got what they wanted. My father reached for my hand. I stepped back. "I didn't come to stay," I said, my voice calm but cutting, each syllable a scalpel slicing through the illusion they had tried to wrap me in. "I came to give you this." I pulled the envelope from my coat pocket and held it out. He took it slowly, like it might explode in his hands. My mother's breath caught. "This is what you came to say?" she asked, her voice cracking under the weight of unspoken questions. "Yes," I replied, my eyes unflinching. "And nothing more." I turned to leave, but my father opened the letter, his hands shaking as he unfolded the paper with trembling care. I didn't stop him. I wanted them to read it. I wanted them to hear the truth in my handwriting, to see the weight of every word they had never allowed me to speak. "You once told me a girl like me could never be a doctor. And you were right. The girl you knew, the one who smiled too hard, spoke too loudly, asked too many questions, and dreamed too recklessly, had to die so that this woman could live. The woman standing before you did not survive because of your love, your lessons, or your legacy. She survived in spite of them. She built herself from shame, carved a spine out of silence, and learned how to save lives while you prayed she'd forget she had won. I didn't walk away because I hated you. I walked away because I loved myself enough to stop begging for a seat at a table that kept shrinking to exclude me. I saved Layla not because of who she was to me, but because of who I have become. I am a doctor. Not your daughter. Not your mistake. Not your redemption. Just a doctor. And this is goodbye. Amira." I didn't wait for them to finish. I turned and walked out the door, my coat whipping in the wind like a flag on a battlefield already abandoned. The sun was warm against my face, and the air tasted like freedom wrapped in finality. Halfway down the street, I saw her. A little girl, maybe 7, standing on the corner with a backpack too big for her small frame and eyes wide with something between awe and curiosity. She stared at my white coat like it was made of stars. "Are you a real doctor?" she asked, her voice soft and filled with something fragile and untamed. I stopped, turned toward her, and knelt so we were eye level, the way I always did with young patients who needed to believe someone saw them. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady and full. "A real one." And this time I kept walking forward, not away from anything, but toward everything I had finally chosen for myself.